Hi class, welcome to Module 7 as we look at education. Here, more than any of the other chapters, you'll find that sociologists will argue about whether this is truly a social problem. But we have to go back to that definition of what a social problem is. And it's highly influenced by what the public feels is a social problem that comes into place. And so comes back and forth. The reason sociologists have a problem sometimes looking at the educational system as a social problem, they really say it's the result of so many other social problems, the result of poverty, inequality, social stratification, race, gender issues coming into place. Yet we know there are big problems in education as well. So you'll end up in this discussion later on whether it truly is a social problem and what's the problems that go with it as you start to look at this. So here, as a student, you've participated in the process of the American education system, yet each of your experiences are very different. I talk about this in my classroom and tell them, I came from a high school with a planetarium and a pool and lots of resources named. The high school's name was Harvey S. Firestone. We had Firestone money in rubber money given to the system to help benefit our school, and by the way, the other 12 high schools in the city of Akron. We were new at the time I went there. We had language labs and labs that anyone would be jealous of. We had 3 gyms. We had squash courts and all different things in place. Not everybody grows up that way. Very different. It's also interesting to look at how education has changed. My grandparents, on my mother's side, were both college graduates. Very, very unusual in the early 1900s. My father's parents, his mother graduated high school and his father completed 11th grade. That was a great education. Today, a bachelor's degree is required, and there's a lot of things that come into place to get a job that previously you were qualified with a high school diploma. And the question that comes into place, does everyone deserve a college education? Now, I would ask you to pay attention to education very carefully, as under the Trump administration, part of the goal is to dismantle the Department of Education at the federal level, because it is a state issue and it is funded by state funds. And there have been significant inputs at the federal level in the past, which has built the Department of Education into large areas. So as the Secretary of Education now, Betsy DeVos, is dismantling it. We're not seeing a whole lot about what's going into place, and we're moving to support more private education and voucher schooling. All of these things are affecting the public education plan. So like any other area, it's really important to look at what is going on currently as we're looking at these social problems. So let me pop over to the PowerPoints as you can read the rest of what's here, and we'll get going with our short class. So, new educational standards. I just mentioned this. Bachelor's degree is becoming a standard in the United States, with more than 30% of adults obtaining at least a bachelor's degree, with the increase of even the mandate of having a master's degree to be able to do many jobs. So we see that approximately 76% of Americans 65 years or older obtained a high school degree, and today it's more like 87% of those. Now, multiple things are happening here, and you need to start thinking about that. Why are more people getting degrees than in the past? Because they need them more. But are we passing students as well that are not reaching that level of education? So here becomes part of the social problems as you're already starting to explore them. I'm going to focus on this within the functionalist perspective, and it's important for you to consider this in all areas as we think about what education does. Public education came into law in the late 1800s in the United States. We were one of the first countries to mandate public education. Part of the reason it comes into place is the change of the work environment. We've gone from rural living, farm-based. We can see the introduction of equipment and technology that has lessened the burden on the farm and changed the way that farm living exists. We see that people move to the cities for jobs, and they are working industry. And in industry, we start putting on child protection laws so that we don't have 7 and 8-year-olds in the mines working in those tiny areas. We see that children are at home longer. So we create a public education system to help educate this population. Now remember, we've talked about gender before, this idea that women stayed home, took care of the house, and took care of the kids. Once there was this industrial revolution, is a nice thought, but in reality, women were still working. So what was happening to kids at that point that weren't in jobs? Well, education becomes that latent function of the public babysitter and controls the entry and timing into the workforce. It protects the population, it protects the individual, and it teaches in that manifest function. It teaches proper socialization. It takes the children out of that home and it teaches them what are the standard norms into place. So how to sit in rows and how to open up a book and what education should look like. Why do you sit in rows in class? Do you learn better that way? Well, no. We know research shows you don't. In fact, even when we look at the difference between online learning and in class, people online can learn just as much in class if they're involved in the class. It doesn't make a difference. You can be listening to this as you're driving. You can be working on things. It is how you learn best that makes importance as we consider it. But you can see the fundamentalist perspective. These tasks are important. These are the primary tasks that come into place to educate people, and it's important. Now, the conflict perspective looks at education is not an equalizer, but a divider. That if we live in a rich community, our schools are going to be better, and we're going to succeed more in that process, and that the socialization function of education is part of that indoctrination into this bureaucratic idea, and it organizes. So it creates this organized child who's carefully instructed and supervised, guided through the day in order to fit the agendas of the community. I think of a Harry Chapin song, and most of you won't even know who Harry Chapin is. He wrote Cat's Cradle. You may have heard of that. But he wrote a song about flowers, and it comes to the fact that education oftentimes will insist that you give up that freedom. That's what you're going to be looking at in one of your videos this week. The feminist perspective, no surprise, looks at the difference of the privilege that males have in the classroom and the differences that occur. Sociological studies of the classroom, especially of grade school teachers, have looked at how the majority of grade school teachers, more than 90%, are female, and how they favor males in the classroom, and how that comes into place, that girls become invisible and they become that second-class student, and the girls' movement in the process becomes really important. Believe me, there are other gender issues. Boys receive more praise, correction, and feedback in the process, but boys also sometimes are given the advantage of a break in the process. From the interactionist perspective, we can see how school focuses and creates our lives, that it's classroom dynamics and practices, and then we can see the issues of bullying that comes into place, the reaction between the student and the individual it enforces that inequality in the educational system. I had a student in my intro, in my social problems class this semester said, "What do we call you?" And I said, "You call me Dr. Kirk or you call me Jan, whichever." But do you see the difference in that process? In a classroom, you get this hierarchy and you get this in place, and it reinforces that inequality that comes along, and it reinforces inequality by what people have and what they're available to have. And you can see that in the structure of the groups and organizations. And I guess we come back to Zimmel as he looks at the power of groups to come into place. So as you explore the sociological perspective, you can clearly see how different it is and how social background comes a great deal into place. So, what are the problems with the American education system? Well, we seem to be failing. We have relatively poor performance of American students compared to their international peers. Important to remember, we are not always measuring oranges to oranges, but apples to oranges. The students in European systems are already tracked at younger ages and dropped into those that are going to go in the workforce versus those that are going into college. There is no across the board, and so that we're measuring oftentimes those higher students against the whole population. However, with that said, there are some significant issues that have come into place, especially illiterate generations, students who make it all the way through high school and still cannot read, students who come to college very much not prepared. And so we have this problem with basic literacy, enough to be able to read, to do their job. And we can see literacy across the world is a problem. So in the United States, about 43% of all Americans demonstrate below basic literacy skills. Important to consider. When I was a social worker in a hospital and I ran the educational part of the rehabilitation unit, I had to make up lots of brochures and documents on strokes, Parkinson's, hip replacements, all of those things. You wrote to the fourth grade level. The average American reads at the fourth grade level, which is very problematic. So we can see that affecting school system, where are they at? And yet they've graduated high school. You know those statistics, 80-some% graduate high school. And so these low literacy skills impact their ability to hold a job, participate in the community. U.S. spends more on education than other high-income countries, and yet our literacy scores are average in world comparison. World comparison, not even upper, what we call first world countries comparison. We have high issues of violence. No surprise, as I'm recording this early, we're just coming off another school shooting, and one that was actually foiled when the student was bragging about it on the bus. Then another student recorded it, and they were able to get into his home and find multiple weapons coming into place with him planning violence. But remember, violence in school has always occurred. The largest area of violence up until the last few years was actually back in the early 1900s when a school board member blew up a school with the children in it. It has always been in that area, but there is that feeling of the environment being unsafe. Remember, social problems, when we talk about them, are really driven by the population, and about 63% report feeling unsafe because of their orientation, if they're gay and lesbian. But children in school, teenagers, report feeling unsafe a lot of times just based on their environment. Pretty important as we start looking at it. In 2001, an act called No Child Left Behind went into place under the Bush administration to try to level the field ground. Understand that education, as I said before, is a state responsibility. So do you get the same education in Pennsylvania as you do in New York? There are different measures that come into place. And in fact, as we look at the final testing to get out of high school, No Child Left Behind created this teaching to the test, the standardized testing coming into place, and teachers who could be dismissed if their students did not score well enough on the testing. It changed a lot of the environment, but it tried to put some equality back and forth because the education in Alabama versus Pennsylvania was significantly different. And if you remember that map of poverty, when we look at the people who were poorer, education is often worse in those states where there are more poor people. Significant programs came into place like Head Start, 1965. Head Start came into place to give a heads up for those of lower incomes, that they would be funded and help them come into place and be more prepared for school. Interesting thing as we study Head Start, that the advantage disappears by the time they're in third grade, that the issues of the social problems they're affecting still impacts them highly. We have significant issues for women in schools, that women studies that most girls and women live best in cooperative rather than competitive learning environments, that we need to teach differently based on gender. And there's arguments back and forth how to do that. Do we remove women and have them educated separately from men? And how does that teach them with that interaction? So again, you can see the argument. Boy, great things to consider as you're thinking about your position paper. So how do we improve education? Well, one of the beliefs is that charter school and magnet school and voucher schools are designed to improve education. That is the attitude currently of our Department of Education and our Secretary of Education, that we need to give more support to those, and that we look at that, but researchers consistently show that students from poor families or less educated parents are less likely to participate in public choice. Number one, they can't necessarily get to the magnet school or charter school. There aren't as many opportunities. If the behavior is disruptive in those type of schools, they don't have to keep them, where public schools do have to force that education. Also think about this. We don't have the chance to go into it. We'll go into some things about disability later, but public education has to educate everyone. People with all forms of disabilities have that right. And in private and charter schools and magnet schools, they do not have to accept at the same level. So what are you doing for this week besides listening to 18 to 20-minute video here? I want you to look at 3 videos because there are significant social problems that we're not even covering here, but one of them being just how schools kill creativity. This particular TED Talk by Sir Kenneth Robbins, I think you'll find is interesting as we start thinking about the latent functions of school and how it comes into effect. The other social problem I would like you to look at is student loans. That's a social problem that you're facing. These 2 reports were done this last year by Consumer Reports. They are interviews with students. And I want you to think about the power of student debt and what it affects for the future. Pretty interesting as this issue of higher education becomes the norm in society. And yet, we don't necessarily fund it in the same manner that other countries do. So in Europe, if you've been chosen to go through that higher level school, your college education is basically free because you need it for the future. Does that make a difference in how we grow? Pretty powerful. So your module discussion for this week is, are American schools in crisis? Explain why you believe or why you don't believe they are. Make sure you support your statements. Make sure you cite your sources as you start thinking about what are the true issues here. We'll come back to student debt later, but important things to consider as a social problem. Have a great week.